The Federal Reserve just bailed out the repo market in a serious way for the very first time since 2019 when it blew up last time. This means that you should expect the Fed to start making changes that result in more liquidity, easier financial conditions, and potentially melt-ups across asset classes. Because if they don't, the entire financial system collapses. Here's why. This is a chart that shows the Federal Reserve's intervention into the repo market. And you can see for the past 5 years, they've basically had zero activity in the repo market until June 30th, where they had to inject over $11 billion of overnight cash. If you're not familiar with the repo market, it's just where banks go to get cash from each other. One bank has extra collateral, another bank needs cash. They will agree to swap the cash and collateral with each other as long as there's the promise that in the future, they will repurchase it from each other. Now, if this sounds like a giant pawn shop, it is. If we go all the way back to prior to 2008, a lot of the assets that banks were holding on to around this time were mortgage-backed securities. So banks would go to each other, they'd say, hey, I've got some mortgage-backed securities. I'll give them to you in exchange for some cash that I need for my overnight cash needs. And then in the future, at some point soon, I'll rebuy them from you. Now, this is how banks operate. But as we all know, during the financial crisis, the banks one day realized mortgage-backed securities were not worth all that much. And so nobody was willing to accept them for collateral. Once that happened, banks that only had mortgage-backed securities, like Lehman, weren't able to get that overnight cash that they needed, and they collapsed literally overnight. Now, if we take a look at this exact same chart that goes all the way back to 2000, you can see the Federal Reserve's actions in the repo market were fairly consistent, but then they stopped in October of 2008. And the Fed had basically zero action in the repo market up until September of 2019 when it blew up. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Why in the world would their action in the repo market just end in October of 2008? Well, it's because of the way that the financial crisis was dealt with. In other words, there was so much liquidity injected into the financial system that it was no longer necessary for the Fed to operate in the repo market. So much excess liquidity that banks didn't need to tap on the Fed for that. So you can see the Fed's action in the repo market, in other words, their injection of temporary overnight liquidity, was completely unnecessary for years. In fact, if we take a look at the opposite chart, which shows the Federal Reserve's actions in the reverse repo market, you can see that the excess liquidity conditions got to the point where banks needed somewhere to put all that excess liquidity because they couldn't just keep it with each other. So that ended up going into the reverse repo facility at the Fed starting in 2013. This reverse repo facility is the place where banks can park their excess cash with the Federal Reserve in exchange for temporary collateral. But you can see starting around 2018, banks were no longer facing this trouble of excess liquidity anymore. Their usage of the Fed's reverse repo facility came close to stopping. Fast forward to 2019, and we had swung all the way back to the original problem that banks started to face during the financial crisis. In other words, they needed cash and couldn't get it from each other. And this is why in September of 2019, the repo market blew up. The financial system had worked through all of its excess liquidity, mainly due to a steep rise in government borrowing. In other words, as the government spent and borrowed more and more, it worked through all that excess liquidity, drew it all out of the financial system, and banks woke up in September of 2019 and couldn't access the cash that they needed from each other. They had a bunch of great collateral. It was treasuries this time, but nobody had the cash and everybody needed it. So the Federal Reserve had to do emergency intervention yet again, printing a bunch of money to provide the overnight cash that banks needed. If we zoom in just on this time frame from 2019 through 2020, you can see the Fed's actions in the repo market continued until all of the money printing had happened following what started in early 2020. To clarify, during late 2019 and early 2020, the Federal Reserve was doing temporary liquidity injections into the repo market to help banks deal with their low levels of cash. And then what started in 2020 gave the Fed the excuse that they needed to do one big print and solve that lack of liquidity once and for all, or at least for a couple of years. And you can see once the money printing had happened, the Fed's actions in the repo market completely ceased for years. And switching back over to the other chart, which is the reverse repo facility, you can see that the problem swung back in the opposite direction. The reverse repo facility ballooned to almost $3 trillion by the end of 2022. There was so much excess liquidity in the system and so little collateral for banks to be able to offset it with, they needed somewhere to park it. And so they parked it at the Federal Reserve in their reverse repo facility. Again, the reverse repo facility is the place where banks can park excess liquidity and they get a nice little reward for it. They get paid interest on that. But the year is 2025 now, which means it's been about 5 years since this whole thing started in 2020, which means all of that excess liquidity has now been worked through. Due to excess government spending and deficits for years now, and the Federal Reserve's quantitative tightening, and the Fed raising rates, all of that excess liquidity in the financial system has almost completely dried up, which is why just days ago, we had another repeat of the September 2019 repo market blow up yet again. Now, I want to be clear, it wasn't as bad as it was then. You can see here on the chart, this last intervention was much smaller than it was back in 2019, but it is the largest intervention the Fed has had to do since 2020 when it ended the last time. To clarify again, when the Fed acts in the repo market, it is because they are injecting liquidity because banks cannot access enough cash from each other. And if the Fed doesn't inject that liquidity, it's very possible that banks start falling over like dominoes overnight because banks don't just have the cash, they get it from each other every single night. Now, you might have noticed this little blip from September 30th last year in 2024 when the Fed intervened in the repo market. Even though it was only a couple of $1 billion, it was still a much larger standout compared to everything else around it. Now, it is very important to take good note of what the Federal Reserve did pretty much directly following this intervention in the repo market last year. This happened in September of 2024. Prior to that, the federal funds rate, over the course of just a couple of months, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates by basically a full percentage point. Remember, this is where the Fed intervention in the repo market happened last year. And they lowered rates then to that extent, despite the fact that inflation was higher then than it is now. As of May 2025, the inflation rate, according to the CPI, is 2.4%. And yet from September of 2024 last year, all the way through January, the CPI rose from 2.4 up to 3%. All the while, the Federal Reserve was still lowering interest rates. So here's the situation that they're facing today. Number one, government spending is increasing, not decreasing. Number two, the Treasury plans to issue only short-term debt for now, which means more borrowing and a higher cost from the continual rollover of all that debt. Number three, all excess liquidity in the financial system has basically been drained now. Number four, the inflation rate, according to the CPI, is now lower than it's been since pre-2020. With the April reading of 2.3% and the May reading of 2.4%, we are now solidly back into the levels that the CPI sat in prior to what happened in 2020. And finally, as is the topic of this video, emergency injections into the repo market are back. So that's the situation we are facing today. Here's what you can expect the Federal Reserve to do as a result. Number one, we are going to see reduced bank leverage rules in order to make financial conditions easier for banks. Number two, we are very likely to see the Federal Reserve reduce interest rates significantly over the following year from now. Last time they had to intervene just a little bit in the repo market, they dropped interest rates by a full percentage point. And the time before that, when they had to intervene in the repo market, which was in late 2019, they also started dropping interest rates, ultimately dropping them all the way to zero. I don't expect either of those extremes, but probably we'll get something in the middle of that. Given the size of this recent intervention in the repo market and how it lands kind of in the middle, I would say we're in for over the next year at least a 1% drop in interest rates, probably closer to 2. Number three, the Federal Reserve is very likely to stop quantitative tightening, QT, which is where they let the assets on their balance sheet bleed off. And they are probably even likely to restart QE yet again. Remember, that's what they did in September of 2019. When they called it not QE, they were raising the size of their balance sheet, and they could absolutely start doing that again here. None of these would be extreme, but they would all be significant, coordinated actions in order to make financial conditions easier. All right, here's what you really care about. How is this going to impact markets and the economy? By the looks of it, I would expect that we are about to see a boom in the Austrian sense of the word. In other words, false economic growth as a result of artificially easy credit conditions. The very first thing that happens is this impacts asset prices. If you remember what happened starting in early 2020, the very first thing to get hit was asset prices. All the money printing hit, rates got dropped to zero, asset prices went through the roof. Stocks started skyrocketing. Crypto skyrocketed, real estate skyrocketed, precious metals went through the roof. There is a process by which easy financial conditions and new money work its way throughout an economy. The first thing to experience the benefits is asset prices. This is because all that new money first hits the hands of the rich, and what do they do with it? They buy assets. Then slowly that new money works its way through the economy into the hands of normal people who use that money to increase consumption. They spend it on goods and services and cars and rent and food and travel, driving up the price of goods and services. Now, it's important to note the lag effect here. This is not immediate. Remember, all of the money printing from 2020 started in March of 2020. Yet the CPI didn't get back up to the levels it was at before until a year later, March of 2021. And then it skyrocketed from there. I'm not by any means predicting the same level of printing. So I'm not expecting the CPI in a year or two to hit, 9 or 10% again. But after a year or so of easier financial conditions, the Federal Reserve is very likely to try and reverse course and correct the mistakes that it made by reigniting inflation again. Interest rates will go back up, quantitative tightening might start again, and this will put an end to the boom. In other words, it will start the bust. And the bust is always made inevitable by the boom. We saw this exact same thing happen after all the money printing that happened in 2020 drove asset prices to all-time highs. The Federal Reserve started to tighten conditions because inflation was getting out of control, and this started the unwind, started the bust, triggering the 8-month bear market in asset prices that followed. Now, it's also worth noting that this all fits in perfectly with my expectations of what the Federal Reserve is going to have to do to deal with the terrible fiscal policy going on right now. Increased government spending, increased government borrowing, and tax cuts widening the deficit. Meanwhile, the national debt ballooning and interest costs skyrocketing. The only way that that can be dealt with without default is printing it away. In fact, it is those fiscal decisions that are causing the lack of liquidity right now, forcing the Fed to take action. Also, this fits in perfectly with the 40-year debt cycle. I've talked about this at length in many other videos, but this phase of the 40-year debt cycle started in 2020, where we are going to see for years, potentially longer, rising interest rates and rising prices. This is the opposite of what we had for the 40 years preceding that, from 1980 through 2020, where we had falling interest rates and falling inflation. Not falling prices, but falling inflation. Instead, from here on out, we are likely to see conditions that are very similar from the 1940s through the 1980s, where inflation rose, interest rates for everybody rose, and the government reduced its debt to GDP ratio by inflating the debt away, doing yield curve control, printing money. There was a big growth in economic output, and overall the economy had to pay for that. There are brief periods, though, where interest rates do fall. Conditions get easier. It then reignites inflation, and the Federal Reserve has to reverse course and tighten things up yet again. If indeed this is what we are to expect over the following year or two, a brief period of time in which financial conditions get a lot easier and interest rates go down, do not miss out. Yes, valuations will look extreme. Yes, there will be euphoria. Yes, you will feel FOMO, but take advantage of the boom. Don't get greedy. Watch out for that feeling of euphoria when you can't stop checking your account to see how much money you're making throughout the day. That's a red flag. Don't fall for the FOMO and chase things because you waited too long. And most importantly, always be prepared for the bust that inevitably follows those artificial booms.